What's going on, friends? Welcome back to another New World video. Today we're going to be talking about weapon mastery in New World Aeternum and showcasing builds for 3 different categories: solo or leveling, group PvE, which is expeditions, raids, etc., and PvP, mainly outpost rush, 3v3 arena, and open world PvP. So if you're interested in a particular weapon or a particular playstyle with that weapon, you can scrub along in the video, or you can check the timestamps in the description down below. What I won't be covering in this video is attributes, equip load, and gear. I think if we wanted to do that for each individual weapon, we'd probably be here for another 6 hours. But we will have separate videos breaking down different builds for each weapon in the game. So if you want to see those, make sure you go ahead, click that subscribe button. And if there's any particular builds you would like to see with a combination of weapons, let me know in the comments down below. It's also worth mentioning that the weapon mastery trees I outline in this video are simply just recommendations. They're based on what I find personally works, along with what has worked for players throughout the past 3 years of New World on PC. If you want to tweak any of the templates or disagree with certain abilities being used in the PvP build, for example, that's fine. I'm not suggesting the builds we show in this video are the best in every scenario. They're more of a one-size-fits-all. With that all out of the way, let's kick things off with our leveling build for Sword and Shield. So if you're choosing to level up with the Sword and Shield, or simply just playing it solo, as you get weapon mastery points, I would spend your first 3 on simply just getting some abilities. You know, it's just extra damage effectively. Whirling Blade for some AoE, Shield Bash for the stun and stagger it provides, and Upheaval just for a nice bit of damage. And then from here, I would go ahead and grab some passives that I think, you know, really resonate or shine with Sword and Shield. The first one is Empowered Stab. This gives you a 30% empower for 5 seconds after you do a heavy attack. So every 5 seconds, just do a heavy attack. So much extra damage. It's a no-brainer. Also, there's a couple passives on the Defender tree that give you extra physical armor, reduce your incoming magical damage. Very nice as well. And then from here, I would just go ahead and upgrade the Whirling Blade. You get some Rend or Weaken or Stamina regen, depending on your equip load. Also, Upheaval, you can get 20% extra damage if you're hitting a target that's stunned, which, you know, Shield Bash into Upheaval. And then you've got your Tactical Strike for some cooldown reduction on the Whirling Blade. Tactician, reducing the cooldown of Whirling Blade and Shield Bash. And then also, I think Critical Precision is nice early on. Just every time you crit, you get some movement speed, so you can move around the map faster, complete quests faster. That is going to do it for the solo leveling build. Again, this is just like for the first sort of few weapon mastery points you get. If you want to see what it would look like when you have all 20 points available, check out the group PvE or the PvP builds coming up right now. So in group PvE, like expeditions and raids, Sword and Shield is typically the go-to choice for a tank, and that is how we're designing our weapon mastery here. So this is for tanking, typically in full heavy armor with a tower shield. You're going to go for Whirling Blade. If you take the upgrade, it applies Weaken to the enemy, reducing the damage they do to you and your team. It's all just like a nice ability that you can get on cooldown fairly often. If you do Whirling Blade in a big pack of enemies, you can just keep spinning to win, which is very nice, generates a lot of AoE damage. And then over on the right side, we want to pick up our Taunt. This is one of the best taunts in the game. If you put a Carnelian Gem in your sword, when you do the old Defender's Resolve, tap on your shield, everything is attracted and attacks you for 8 seconds in an 8-meter AoE radius even. And Shield Rush, also just an incredibly good ability, especially if you get the Fortifying Shield Rush perk on your shield. Just gives you a huge amount of Fortify when you hit the enemy. And then we're just going to pick up passives that basically give us more Fortify, you know, reducing incoming damage, increase our healing, and we'll go for the defensive formation upgrade. But some tanks would rather, instead of taking the damage reduction, they go more aggressive and they take leadership. If you wanted to do that, you could simply like take a couple points out of here. So let's take away probably, I think we'd go for this over here, and then we just grab this, this, and this like that. You know, there's a little bit of variation, but effectively this is the default tanking build that I would go for. Some combination of these abilities and then a couple of passives that look impressive to you, ultimately deciding whether you want to go more defensive or more aggressive. In PvP, I think a weapon mastery tree setup like this is kind of optimal for the way Sword and Shield plays. It's usually played as a sort of assassin style, where you have a round shield and your full light armor, and you're very mobile, or you go as a full tanky boy, again with the full heavy armor and your tower shield. But either way, you're playing in a similar sort of playstyle with the Sword and Shield. You have this gap closer with Leaping Strike, which I just think is a must-have ability in PvP. It's so good. It staggers the enemy, so you can interrupt healers. It applies a slow that you then got some synergy where you can do extra damage to slowed foes. You also have another slow with the Shield Rush down here, 30% slow, and another 30% slow. You have a stun which lasts for 2 seconds. Again, being able to interrupt healers or, you know, anybody else that you want to kill. You've got your critical precision for movement speed, and then you've just got some passives that basically make you more tanky. So reducing incoming damage, giving you some stamina with these two abilities, and of course the empowered stab for the damage increase. You may have noticed we haven't spent the remaining 5 points here, and that's because it's kind of flexible. If you want to be more of the on the point tanky boy, sort of controlling the flow of fight, then you could take recuperation. You could go for the good old defensive training. And then I think we would probably just take Sturdy Grip as well, grabbing this defensive and then maybe one more passive over here. Or we can instead remove those points that we just spent and instead go over here on the right-hand side, maybe get some Rend, get the debuff cleanse, and go for leadership if we want to give a bit more damage to ourselves and our teammates. So just like with the group PvE, in PvP you can also be more damage-orientated, or you can be more defensive-orientated depending on your playstyle. And I think there's merits to both. But I do believe Leaping Strike, Shield Bash, and Shield Rush just so disruptive. Leaping, and then staggering, and then stunning. Just your opponent doesn't get to do anything. So very oppressive build. Definitely recommend a similar layout to this in PvP. With the Rapier, there are 3 different ways that it's commonly played. And to kick things off with our solo or leveling build, we're going to go for the Blood style build, which involves using Flurry, Tondo, and Flourish and Finish. So our first 3 points are going to go into these abilities. The concept is basically apply bleeds. You can do this with Tondo. You can even do this with Flurry if you fully upgrade it. You can extend the duration of bleeds as well. And then you strip away those bleeds for a big burst of bonus damage with Flourish and Finish. But obviously for the first sort of 10, 11 levels, while you don't have max weapon mastery, instead I would recommend going for something like this. So we upgrade Flurry down to Fleeting Strikes, gives us some cooldown reduction. We also get some more cooldown reduction with Refreshing Strikes. This allows us to Flurry very often. And if you can get a perk called Leeching Flurry on your Rapier or your armor, going to give you a big chunk of lifesteal, which is going to help a lot. And then from here, we're just going to try and get that big bonus damage upgrade, which means we need to put one more point over here. We'll get the base damage increase when the target is above 50% health, and then we can take our upgrade. And that's what I think, you know, your beginnings of a Rapier build in solo would look like. For our Rapier build in group PvE, we're going to showcase something a little bit different rather than going for the Blood skill tree, which is very popular, and you can absolutely do that. But instead, we're going to go for a Evade build, effectively. So again, just like with the Leeching Flurry thing that we talked about in solo, there's another perk you can get called Omnidirectional Evade. If you get Omnidirectional Evade on your Rapier or your armor, increases your damage every time you use Evade, effectively. And then you have your ultimate over here. It says deal 30% increased base damage on your next light or heavy attack after performing an ability. And the way this effectively works is you press Evade, and then you do a light attack for the 30% bonus damage, and then you press Flurry, and then you do a light attack for the 30% bonus damage. By this point, your cooldown reduction, because Flurry is so good at lowering cooldown, and then you've got Refreshing Strikes for lowering cooldown, and then I'm pretty sure there's another critical strikes reduce cooldowns. If you're getting backstabs, by the way, guaranteed criticals, so always go for backstabs with this build if you can. It's effectively just like Evade, light attack, Flurry, light attack, Evade, light attack, Flurry, light attack, and we've got Riposte over here. You're not going to be using it too often, but if you do find yourself in a bit of a pickle, you can reflect an attack back at the enemy, stun them, get a little Empower, and it gives you more cooldown reduction as well. So that's the concept with this build here. It's basically just spamming light attacks and weaving abilities in between them. And then for our PvP build with the Rapier, I'm actually going to give you guys 2 different options. The Rapier is very commonly used as a secondary weapon with builds like Lifestaff. So healers commonly use Rapier as a secondary, and they use a lot of the Grace skill tree for evasion. But let's kick things off with the damage. So if you want to be a damage-oriented Rapier player, this is a skill tree that I would go for. You got a bit of mobility with Flash over here, so you can duck and dodge around. We've got Flurry, again, with that Leeching Flurry upgrade, just very powerful in PvP. You can get close to the enemy and just put a bleed on them, and then you're going to strip away the bleed with the Flourish and Finish. This also is a stagger. Staggers and stuns are very important in PvP. So is our movement speed. So again, we got the Flash, we got Swiftness. I just think the idea here is basically just try and get a Flurry on the enemy, followed by a Flourish and Finish. But sometimes you can just go straight into Flourish and Finish for a little bit of a burst damage, or even as a mobility option, because it sort of slashes sideways and then it goes forward. In fact, let's just briefly show that real quick here. I just realized I don't have a Rapier, but we'll put some footage over the top of the video. Right, let's go to our other build here, and we'll just edit forward in time. So this is the makings of a Rapier when it's used as a secondary. So we're not really using the Rapier for damage here, just for escape. So if you're somebody who's playing a Lifestaff or a healer in PvP, you might have a Rapier as a secondary, and you simply just switch to it to use the abilities. So again, you need to lock in the mindset that this is not for damage. This is just used for escaping, basically. So the enemy gets close to you, and then you're going to do a swirly twirly away. I keep forgetting that I don't have a rapier. But yeah, the enemy gets close, you use flash to dodge away, you can use evade, it gives you a little bit of stamina, gives you a movement speed boost, and then if you're still in a pickle, you can also use riposte and reflect a melee attack at a nearby enemy to stun them. So after here, you can spend the points wherever you want. It doesn't really matter. Momentum would give you a damage increase, but again, that's not what this build is about. It's simply just there for its abilities. So spend the remaining passives where you want, but this is the sort of makings. I guess you could fully upgrade the flesh just to get some cooldown reduction. Might make sense as well. But yeah, that is our Rapier as a secondary, mainly paired with Life Staff. That's what the PvP build would look like there. Hatchet as a solo or leveling weapon is an excellent choice, and that's largely due to the Berserker skill tree, getting Defy Death, and all the benefits that the Berserk ability give you. But for our first 3 points, we're going to grab Berserk, we're going to grab Raging Torrent, and we're going to grab Rending Throw. I just think they're very easy to use, and in PvE, when fighting against AI, these often end up being the best abilities, as you'll see with the group PvE build as well. From here, we're just going to go ahead and fully upgrade, so your next remaining weapon mastery points would all go into Berserk. Just every upgrade here is very useful. Lifesteal, movement speed, not being able to be interrupted. Effectively, you can't be staggered. Very nice in many different scenarios. And then we're just going to pick up a few passives that will increase our damage and our survivability. So extra base damage when enemies are nearby, removing burn, bleeds, and poisons when we dip below 30%. Abilities and heavy attacks. By the way, don't really focus on heavy attacks. Light attacks are generally the playstyle that people go for with Hatchet. It's kind of what works, but still extra damage to enemies when they're below 30% health. And we've also got every sort of fourth attack. So after 3 successful light attacks, the next attack is a 20% base damage increase. And then we're going to pick up the Defy Death so we can avoid dying. I mean, you know, what's not to like about that? Every 60 seconds being able to cheat death. And that's what the initial weapon mastery, I think, would look like for a solo or leveling build with the Hatchet. For group PvE, if you're playing in a raid or an expedition, things are fairly similar to our solo leveling build. All we've done is we've dropped a few passives over here, and we've spent a lot more points on the right-hand side of the skill tree so we can get this damage increase. Persistent Hindrance basically allows us to do more damage to the target based on how many debuffs they have. And in a group setting, when you have players applying Rend and Weaken and Burns and Bleeds and Poisons, it's very consistent that you can get the max damage increase, which, if my maths is correct, I think it's about 18, 16, 4, 8, 12, 16. Yeah, 16% extra damage to the enemies, provided they have at least 4 debuffs on them. And you can also, there's a little bit of a synergy with the top one. But yeah, Rending Throw, going to apply Rend to the enemy, making them take more damage, and immediately just sets up 4% extra damage there. We keep Raging Torrent just because it's a really nice ability you can spam. If you get a perk on your armor or weapon called Refreshing Torrent, it lowers your cooldown, so you can basically just cycle through these a lot faster. And then Berserk, as we previously covered, it's just a really good ability. It's got kind of everything you want baked into it. If you are feeling a little bit more squishy, if you don't trust your healer as much, you could reduce your outgoing damage and instead take Defy Death. To do that, you probably just drop a couple passives over here and then spend them over on the right-hand side, ultimately getting Defy Death. But I think, assuming you got a good healer, go for the right side ultimate instead. And then finally, for our PvP build with the Hatchet, we're instead switching out the Rending Throw and the Raging Torrent for Social Distancing and Infected Throw. These are much more PvP orientated abilities. They apply a slow. It also gives you a movement speed increase, so this just allows you to close the gap in the enemy. And the final upgrade applies a root, so if you want to chase down a healer or somebody who's trying to get away from you, this is just such a good ability. And then again, to deal with healers or people who are receiving healing, you have Infected Throw, which reduces incoming and outgoing healing with the disease. Fairly solid option there. If you want to go full glass cannon, you can go for Persistent Hindrance. Again, that's going to get, because of the slow, the root, and the disease, you'll be able to get at least 3 procs there. But I think Defy Death, you know, especially in those smaller scale situations, like if you're 1v1 on the PvP island, being able to cheat death, you know, that's a pretty powerful ability every 60 seconds. So, and of course, we keep the Berserk. We've talked about it in all the other skill trees, but it's just such a good ability. It gives you CC immunity or stagger immunity, cleanses, slow, stuns, roots. It gives you lifesteal, movement speed increase. It's just a nuts ability. So I think you always want to use Berserk, but this is our PvP skill tree setup. And we just make a few changes for some more PvP oriented abilities. So obviously these are throwing abilities, so you can use them from a distance, and that just helps a lot with basically pressing Berserk, throwing some stuff at them, and then running down and just left clicking them, or light attacking, sorry, with the right trigger and controller. yeah, just spamming attacks until they die effectively. Playing solo with the Flail, leveling up with the Flail, is a little bit awkward because neither of the ultimates really benefit you. They require to have an ally nearby to link to them or to give them some passive healing. That being said, it is still pretty strong when paired with weapons like the Life Staff, where you stand inside your heals and then you just swing at them with the Flail. The first 3 points, as always, are going to go into abilities or getting towards abilities, so I would recommend going for Arcane Smite, Arcane Vortex, and then I'm actually quite a fan of Trip when it comes to playing solo. Just being able to CC the enemy, knock them down, gives you a bit of a breather to activate a potion, or just, you know, get some extra damage in while they're down. So our first few points are going to go over here, and then after that, I would just fully upgrade the Smite. When you have the fully upgraded version of Smite, you leave this little purple circle on the ground, and when you stand in it, you get Lifesteal, which is pretty nice. I think also upgrading Trip over here as well for the Rend, making the enemy take more damage, and Fortify, increasing your armor so you take less damage effectively. That's also pretty nice. Some other passives that really shine with the Flail, especially solo, is this one here. When no allies are within 5 meters, all Flail attacks deal 15% more base damage. Just a pretty good damage increase over there. And I think also getting the cooldown reduction. It does different things when you're in heavy, light, or medium, but it's still pretty effective as well. So that's what the initial skill tree I would reckon, you know, playing solo with the Flail would look like. In group PvE, again, like expeditions and raids, Flail is typically used as a tanking weapon. Healers sometimes use it as a secondary, but a lot of the time that is Void Gauntlet. So we're going to showcase a tanking build here with the Flail and Shield. It's going to involve Arcane Vortex. It's just a really nice ability to land in a pack of enemies. It gives your teammates Empower as well, increasing their damage. It has Grit, so you can't just be like knocked around. We're also going to keep that Trip ability. Again, just being able to trip up enemies is quite nice. If we fully upgrade it, we get a heavy attack at the end, which triggers Cured Flailman. It says use it. The first target hit with a heavy attack within 3 seconds of using ability will cleanse a debuff from yourself effectively, and it also weakens the enemy and puts a damage over time effect. And then I also really like Warding Bludgeon as a taunt. If you can get a perk called Crowded Bludgeon, specifically on your Flail, you can use Warding Bludgeon over and over again in a big pack of enemies. So you can get 4 or 5 enemies. We'll try and get some footage on the screen if I can. But you can basically go infinite with the Warding Bludgeon taunt, which is just really, really good. It applies a huge Fortify, links yourself to an ally, gives them Empower, gives them damage absorption, and so does the Human Shield as well. This makes you take 50%, or an ally only takes 50% of the incoming damage, but you only get 35%. So you're effectively just removing 15% damage from the enemy. So very solid tanking option. Got a great ability for some AoE, you got some good CC, and you have a very powerful taunt. So this is what I would say is a good group PvE tanking weapon mastery skill tree for the Flail. In PvP, again, we are looking at that tanking aspect with the Flail. It can be used by healers and sometimes by some strange DPS builds, but I'd say it mainly shines, again, as a point tank sort of build. So if you're on the point and you're trying to maintain control of it, you can help your teammates with the Arcane Vortex. Again, gives everybody a haste buff, so allowing them to move in and out of the combat faster. It gives that Empower, as we talked about. It roots the enemies, not allowing them to move. And it also cleanses CC from your teammates. This isn't as important in PvE, but in PvP, being able to cleanse, root, slows, and stuns, that's huge. Still like to go for the right side ultimate. I just don't think the healing over here is good enough, especially if you don't have that many points in focus. So just being able to redirect some incoming damage. And then we got our Trip, and we've got our Warding Bludgeon. This, again, you can link to a teammate. You can give them Fortify, reducing incoming damage, and we got Trip. So the concept here is basically to stand on the point and use Mending Vortex or Arcane Vortex to keep your teammates alive and lock down the enemy. And then if somebody's running for your healer in the backline, you can Trip to knock them down. And then you can also use Warding Bludgeon. You're going to connect yourself to that healer or that ally that you're trying to keep alive and redirect some damage to you. So yeah, very much like a support kind of tank build with the Flail in PvP. Spear is one of a few weapons in New World that is excellent in almost every single scenario, but let's kick things off again with our solo or leveling build for the Spear, and we're going to stick to the right side so that we can go and pick up our Exploited Weakness ultimate. So we'll grab Skewer, which is a very nice damaging ability. Also puts bleed on the enemy and a little bit of movement. We'll get Perforate, which can apply Rend, making the enemy take more damage. And then we're going to go for Vault Kick. I'm not the biggest fan of Vault Kick, to be honest, but it just allows us to get down to Exploited Weakness faster. And this says the more debuffs are on the target, the more damage you do. We have a Bleed for a debuff. We have a Rend for a debuff. And then I think we also fully upgrade. Yeah, if we go fully upgrade on Perforate, we can also apply Weaken as well. So we got 3 different debuffs there. Bleed, Rend, and Weaken. to give us 30% extra damage, and then you can occasionally just throw a Vault Kick in there. Kicking them in the face is pretty fun also. And if we fully upgrade the Vault Kick, we can get some cooldown reduction so we can use our Skewer and our Perforate more often. I think these abilities are so powerful that you mainly just want to focus on upgrading them. The bleed duration to 15 seconds, probably going to be killing enemies in solo faster than that. So instead, let's just grab some cooldown reduction with the light attack so we can use our abilities more often, and then grab Exploited Weakness. So nice, sort of neat, compact skill tree for solo leveling with the spear. This is what the first few weapon mastery points, in my opinion, should look like. Hey, it's post-edit Baggins here, interrupting myself from the future. I was just watching back the video, and I wanted to make some suggestions as a change here. Instead of taking Vault Kick, I think it would be better to actually go Cyclone for a solo build. So putting 2 points into Cyclone gives you stamina, and then if you can, there's a perk over here called Leeching Cyclone. You put this on your weapon or your armor. It's just a very, very strong, like, it keeps you alive with a big pack of enemies. You pop it, you full heal. Obviously, the downside is we don't get the Exploited Weakness, but with a few more points, we could grab Precise Jabs, and then we could go over here. So a little bit more weapon mastery, more than the normal that I was using for these builds, but I do think something like this would be better, actually, for a solo build. Moving over to our group PvE build with the spear, we're instead switching out that Vault Kick for Cyclone. There is a perk you can get called Leeching Cyclone. If you put it on your armor or weapon, Cyclone gives you a lot of health when it hits enemies, basically, so you can keep yourself topped up in the fight. It just ends up being more useful than Vault Kick. It's also some consideration to go for Sweep to knock down the enemies, but we'll focus on that in the PvP build. Again, we're keeping Perforate for the reasons that it applies Rend, it applies Weaken, Skewer, especially with a perk that you can get called Enfeebling Skewer. There's a lot of perks that are prerequisites here, but again, that's like a separate video. Enfeebling Skewer just applies a huge weaken to the enemy, very powerful in PvE for reducing the damage bosses do and stuff like that. And we are going to keep that Exploited Weakness. I just think it's very consistent that your enemy will have debuffs on them, especially if you're playing with a team. Whereas this one is only 25% increase in base damage, and your stamina has to be full. And, you know, with dodging and stuff, it's just not always going to be active. So instead, Exploited Weakness, and then the passives that we all sort of enjoy here. Critical hits, extend the duration of debuffs, extra damage to bleeding targets, cooldown reduction, crit chance. Yeah, this is what I would say is a solid build for group PvE with the spear. And then for PvP, we're making a few changes here. We're still keeping our Exploited Weakness, because again, just applying debuffs to the enemy is super easy with the abilities we have. But this time we're going to go for the knockdown with Sweep. There is some consideration to not fully upgrade the Sweep. Instead, what you can do is knock them down on the ground, and then instead of going for the follow-up stab, you can do Perforate. So you knock them down on the ground, and then you jab, jab, jab. I do like that combo, but just to keep things simple, we're going to fully upgrade the Sweep so we can get that follow-up heavy stab. This can also trigger certain abilities that like heavy attacks, such as defensive stance, and I think there's a few other things for cooldown reduction. Yeah, heavy attacks with cooldown reduction, so you can switch out some passives here if you want. But again, Skewer gives us the movement, it puts a bleed on the enemy. Perforate's just such a good ability because it does like 16 different things, and Sweep, it's just that important CC, you know, that crowd control, the knockdown, can often help you secure kills on the enemy. So this is our PvP weapon mastery build for the spear. Great Axe is a weapon that shines mostly in group content, group PvP and PvE, but you could play it solo if you wanted to do that. I think putting your first 3 points into Execute, Whirlwind, and Maelstrom would be the go-to. I'm not the biggest fan of either Whirlwind or Execute, to be honest, but they do some decent damage, especially if we go put a few more points into Whirlwind. We can get a movement speed increase. We can allow it to spin a lot more time, so it could be handy in a pack of enemies. Maelstrom, however, I think this is the winning ability here, so we would spend the remaining points upgrading this bad boy, and then we would be working towards Mauler's Fury. If you wanted Great Axe to be your main weapon when you're leveling up, just getting that Empower every time you hit the enemy for a total of 30% extra damage, quite nice. So let's grab a few passives that are going to help us move towards that. We're going to get Enduring Strike. It says adds grit to Great Axe heavy attacks. Also, you get damage reduction while you have grit. And if I'm not mistaken, I think we do have grit on our Whirlwind. So Whirlwind now gives us damage reduction as well. We can get the stamina when we fall below 50% health. This can be good just to give us an extra dodge. And then we can also get a Empower, increasing our damage when we're in 3 or more foes. And we can bring foes to close to us with Maelstrom. We can Whirlwind to sort of spin them all down, and then we can go for Execute to hopefully, you know, get a big burst damage there as well on single targets. So this is our weapon mastery skill tree here. This is what I think would be decent when it comes to leveling up solo with the Great Axe. For group PvE, we're going to be changing things up a bit, and that's because Great Axe is typically used as a secondary weapon. So usually you'll have like a Greatsword or something like that, and that'll be where your damage is coming from, and you switch over to the Great Axe to use its abilities, pull all the enemies together, and then switch back. As a result of that playstyle, as a result of what Great Axe does best, which is clumping up enemies, we're going to take Reap. This allows you to pull one enemy in. We're going to take Maelstrom, again, pulling enemies in. And we're going to take Gravity Well, again, pulling enemies in and holding them in one location. So you're very much there to facilitate clumping up nice groups of enemies so then everybody can hit them all at the same time. As a result of that, we're not going to spend too much time getting advantage from Mauler's Fury because it's basically switch to the weapon, use the abilities, and switch back. So we may as well take the ultimate that instantly kicks in, and that is Bloodlust. It says you move 20% faster and you just get a 15% empower when you're looking at an enemy. So yeah, we can effectively kick this in straight away, whereas it would take a little while. We'd have to hit them 5 times with light or heavy attacks in order to get the equivalent of what Bloodlust gives us. So that's our group PvE build for the Great Axe. In PvP, we make some slight changes, but not too much. We're basically just switching out Reap for Charge. I think Charge, just having some movement options in PvP is very valuable as a way to chase down enemies or to run away from enemies if you find yourself outnumbered or something. And again, we're going to make a few slight changes over here. We're going to keep that Maelstrom just to pull enemies in. You can kind of use it in the same way you would use Reap, and Gravity Well. It's just a staple in PvP. I feel like not taking Gravity Well in PvP is wrong. You know, you can pull the enemies in and hold them close. Albeit this is more for group PvP. If you're playing solo, you might want to keep the Reap instead of Gravity Well. But again, we are going to keep that Bloodlust. As we've talked about, movement speed. This gives you a 20% movement speed increase when you're looking at the enemy. We've got Charge to chase them down, Maelstrom to pull them in, Gravity Well to keep them there, and then we're just going to start hitting them with some attacks, trying to drop them down low so we can get this bonus damage. The Warhammer, similar to the Great Axe, I believe shines more in group content than in solo, but you could use it as a leveling weapon. If you wanted to do that, I would take Wrecking Ball, Mighty Gavel, and then Armor Breaker. Armor Breaker, very good single target. If we fully upgrade this, we can get some big rend on the enemy, making them take a lot more damage. Mighty Gavel is a bit of an unusual one. It's not very common to see it used with the Warhammer, but I think if you were going to play solo, it would make a lot of sense as the fully upgraded version. Gives it a decent spike in damage, gives you grit, and it reduces cooldown. And then from here, I would just pick up an Empower on heavy attacks, Hammer Time. That's a great name for an ability, so we can then go ahead and fully upgrade Mighty Gavel. So this is what I would rock when I was solo, at least while I was leveling up, but there are going to be some pretty big changes to this when it moves over to group PvE. And let's take a look at that now. Since Warhammer is typically more used as a secondary weapon, it's usually tanks that play Sword and Shield Warhammer, or again, you could have a Great Axe and Warhammer. It's typically you're switching to the Warhammer, you use the abilities, and then you switch back. So as a result, we've made a few changes here. You're going to be dropping Shockwave for stuns. You can also get a perk called Sundering Shockwave, which adds a rend component to this as well, making them take more damage. It's got Weaken. There's another perk called Sundering Clear Out, which you can put, again, on your weapon or your armor. Adds rend to the Clear Out. And then you've got Armor Breaker over here. Again, even more rend. You can get to the rend cap almost just by using these abilities. So you can really reduce the enemy's armor with your Sundering Shockwave, your Sundering Clear Out, and your Armor Breaker. Again, just default has rend in it as well. Don't really need to take Aftershock, to be honest, in PvE. I think slowing the enemies, typically they're just going to be running at you anyway. It's very rare that enemies run away from you. But I grabbed it just because, you know, why not? And then we're going to take some other passives here that allow us to do more damage, give us a little bit of self-healing, do more damage. You know, effectively, that's going to be the common theme across here. There's a little bit of confusion with Clear Out. This does knock enemies back, but in PvE, especially in like mutated expeditions, it simply just knocks them down instead, so it's less disruptive. So if you spend a lot of time grouping up enemies with the Great Axe and then just knock them all away again, it kind of defeats the purpose, right? But it doesn't do that in PvE. It actually just knocks them down instead of knocking them back, which makes a lot more sense. So that is our build for group PvE, mainly just to apply lots of rend, making the enemy take more damage. For PvP with the Warhammer, we're going to be making some changes again, switching out that Clear Out for Path of Destiny instead. Again, as we mentioned, Clear Out knocks enemies back. It doesn't do it in PvE, but it very much does in PvP, and sometimes you don't want to knock the enemies back. You want to keep them all nice and tightly clumped up together so you can do a lot of damage with your other AoE abilities. So instead, we're switching to Path of Destiny. This gives us a little bit of a ranged option, so you can sort of send this Shockwave forward, allowing you to stagger enemies and interrupt them. The slow becomes a lot more useful, but we're going to keep that Shockwave there for the stun that it applies. We're going to keep the Armor Breaker to give us a bit more single target damage. And then we're going to switch out a few more passives here instead to give us some cooldown reduction, and also applying Exhaust to the enemy, reducing their stamina income, or the way that they regenerate stamina. That's a lot more powerful in PvP. Stamina is king in PvP. So this is what a build would look like with Warhammer in PvP. The Greatsword, like with the Spear, is another one of those weapons that I think shines in almost all forms of content in New World. But if you wanted to play it solo, if you were leveling up with it, I would put the first 3 points into the left-hand side skill tree, grabbing the Crosscut, Relentless Rush, and Skyward Slash abilities. Greatsword has a unique mechanic where after you use a red ability, you go into the Onslaught mode. After you use a blue ability, you go into Defiance mode. Defiance makes you take less damage, but you also do less damage, and it's the opposite over here. You do more damage, but you do also take more damage. You're going to be wary of that. You also get Quick Charge, and your heavy attacks charge 50% faster. So doing heavy attacks after you use one of these abilities, it's very, very powerful. After this, I would then go ahead and upgrade our Crosscut. We'd get the extra damage down here. We get the Empower with the Relentless Rush. There's also another perk down here as well called Step and Strike. It says after dodging, you get Empower. Also, Critical Comeback gives you stamina and health regen per second for 5 seconds. Very nice for the sustain. We can get Heavy Blade, charged heavy attacks. As we've already covered, we want to be doing those fairly often, so just getting some more armor pen. And I think to make sure that you stay in Onslaught mode, Aggressive Shift is pretty nice as well, without even using an ability. If we just use a heavy attack, that just guarantees we stay in red mode all the time. And then obviously we're going to take the upgrade, or the ultimate here, which gives us cooldown reduction whenever we do a light attack, but especially when we do a heavy attack, 10% cooldown reduction on all of our abilities. So yeah, it's just use an ability, heavy attack, use an ability, heavy attack, use an ability, heavy attack, or you can just go through all of your abilities and then just do heavy attacks until they come off of cooldown. That's the kind of playstyle there. For group PvE, we are going to be switching out Crosscut for Rupture. This applies Weaken, it removes debuffs, and it can also pull the enemies closer, which, as we covered with the Great Axe, being able to clump up enemies in PvE is very handy. There's also some other passives on the right-hand side, like getting Grit on our charged heavies is quite nice. The sort of optimal way to be playing Great Axe in a group PvE scenario is just be doing heavy attacks as much as you can. You actually don't want to spend too much time using abilities. Usually it's just correct to just go in and heavy attack, heavy attack, heavy attack. That's the way that you get the most damage. But you can use the abilities, obviously, to apply the Weaken. That's why Skyward Slash doesn't have the full upgrade, because we don't want to do that follow-up attack, because it's actually more effective to just simply be doing heavies. As soon as you go into Onslaught mode, that's the way to get the highest damage. So yeah, spend less time using abilities and more time doing heavies is basically the go-to with the Great Axe, or the Greatsword, sorry. But when it's appropriate, obviously when you do need to apply that Weaken, when you do need to move in and out of action, you should also occasionally use Relentless Rush and stuff as well. And when it comes to PvP with the Greatsword, I'm a big fan of Steadfast Strike and fully upgrading Skyward Slash. Again, we're going to keep that Relentless Rush because it's a nice movement ability. Instead, we'll take the left side upgrade here because it applies a root. Being able to root the enemies is quite handy. We're going to keep that cooldown reduction over there just because, you know, this doesn't end up being that much of extra incoming healing. Only healing for 5% of the damage from attacks. Not that big of a deal. But yeah, Steadfast Strike, it gives you some stamina, gives you some cooldown reduction. It's also a bit of a gap closer as well. Skyward Slash applies Disease, allowing you to reduce the healing of enemies. And then the other passives over here are basically to facilitate giving us movement speed, giving us extra damage, and helping us sort of stay alive in some situations as well. So that's our PvP build for the Greatsword. Unlike with the previous weapons we just covered, the Great Axe and the Warhammer, the bow is a weapon that shines a bit more in small scale or solo content in my opinion, because it doesn't provide that much in the way of debuffs, so there's not that much in the way of stuns or slows or rends. But nonetheless, like I say, excellent solo weapon, and if you were leveling up with the bow, I would put your first few points into Penetrating Shot, followed by grabbing Rending Headshot, and then Evade Shot and Poison Shot. Ultimately, we're going to be working towards Evasive Tactics. I just think this is the easier ultimate to pull off. You basically dodge, and then you get a 15% Empower for 5 seconds, as opposed to specifically going for headshots. This is just a lot more achievable. So to do that, we would put a point into Evasive Knockback, then we'd fully upgrade our Poison Shot over here, pick up some passives that are going to allow us to do extra damage and maybe give us a bit of movement speed. Whenever you switch to the bow, you get a movement speed increase. Whenever you dodge at full stamina, you get a movement speed increase. This is just going to help with questing and moving around the map. And then also some cooldown reduction if you hit a foe below 50%. That's kind of nice as well, just to be able to use those abilities more often. And grabbing Evasive Tactics. If you want to, you could switch out Penetrating Shot for Rain of Arrows. I think it's fine to go for. I just like the single target nature of the bow. I think trying to introduce AoE, it can work, but my opinion is bow is much more of a single target damage weapon. So these are the abilities that I want to pick up. And ideally, you know, Rapid Shot and I think even Explosive Arrow over Evade Shot are better. But just so we can get that ultimate early on, this is what I would recommend going for. When it comes to group PvE, as we previously mentioned, the bow isn't something that shines that much because it's largely a single target damage weapon, so it can be okay against bosses. If you wanted to use it, I think something like this would be optimal. Again, we want to keep that evasive tactics just because it's very easy to activate. I also think Rapid Shot is very solid as a single target damage option. You basically, if you land all 3 shots, it reduces its cooldown, so you can cycle this over and over. I also think Explosive Arrow and Poison Shot, just for the lingering damage effect that they leave. They put poison and they put a burn on the enemy. It's sort of a nice setup here. Because we only have one ability on the left side, we do have to take a lot of passives instead to make our way towards evasive tactics. But there are quite a few passives over here that are pretty solid as well, like increasing the damage that heavy attacks or arrows in general go. Heavy attacks doing more damage, getting health and headshots. But yeah, the way that it is, it's kind of awkward because we want these abilities, but we need to get this ultimate over here. So potentially you could finagle things a little bit different, but this is a baseline PvE build. If you did want to play bow in like expeditions or raids, I think this wouldn't be too bad. When it comes to PvP with the bow, there are many different ways you can take it. They're all kind of viable. You can go for like a damage of a time build with the bleed from Rain of Arrows and then putting some, burns and poison on them as well. But what we're opting to go for here is more of a skill-based build, shall we call it? So it feels more involved, and it's basically just about landing your shots. So the way that bow is typically played, by the way, is to do a heavy attack straight into a pen shot, followed by another heavy attack, and then that'll get them down to about half. And then if you can land your 3 rapid shots from there, that will kill them effectively. So heavy attack into pen shot into another heavy attack, followed by a rapid shot, and you've got your evade shot over here just to create some distance if you need it as well. And of course, we're going to go for that left side ultimate just because it's a lot more consistent and easy to use. Dodge every 5 seconds, get that damage increase. So yeah, there is a lot of different ways you can play the bow. This is just one build that we're going to outline for PvP that is probably more skill-based. Again, you do have to be landing your shots here as opposed to just doing some big AoEs. There is definitely some merit to instead switching over to Rain of Arrows, Poison Shot, and Explosive Arrow just for a lot of damage over time, and ultimately still working towards that evasive tactics on the left side. Along with the bow, the musket is another example of a weapon that shines more in solo content and especially in PvP. But if you did want to play it while you were leveling up, I think the Trapper side skill tree does have some merit, largely because of, where is it? This one here, Scent of Blood. It says dealing damage to a target heals you for 100% of weapon damage dealt. So every single point of damage you deal gives you 100% lifesteal. That's pretty nuts. And then because we're going to be running traps, we may as well go for the extra damage to traps as well, so we can then ramp up that lifesteal even more. So to make that happen, we're going to start things off with Stopping Power, then of course getting traps, and then Sticky Bomb. And from here, we want to fully upgrade our traps so we can keep them out as often as possible, just giving us a lot of lifesteal. I think Tactical Reload, dodging reloads the musket can be quite nice. So you shoot and then you dodge and you instantly get a reload. Picking up Empowering Weakness, if you hit a target with a debuff, aka if they're in a trap, then you can get some extra damage. Also, another one over here. After dodge, you get a movement speed increase. So you're dodging to get a reload, dodging to get some movement speed. You can just do this while you're running from quest to quest. And also, I think this isn't really that good. Exhausted, much more of a stamina thing. In fact, is there anything else that I would want to take here? Yeah, I'd probably actually go for Salt in the Wound. So just make a last second change here. I was going to recommend this, but I don't think it does too much in PvE, to be honest. And then we'll get that lethal combo. So yeah, largely revolving around your chaps here. Sticky Bomb can just do a bit of extra damage as well in AoE, and then you got your Stopping Power to sort of stagger and knock them back just to keep enemies away a bit as well. But yeah, traps and the lifesteal is really what's going to make this build shine. And you don't want to be just exclusively using Rapier. I think putting them in a trap and then weapon swapping, that does also still maintain the Scent of Blood passive, which is pretty nuts also. If you wanted to play Musket in a group scenario, it's quite uncommon, but I think it would look as something like this, taking Power Shot, Powder Burn, and Shooter Stance, with the idea that you're basically just gonna be a headshot god. So you'd have to be landing lots of headshots. There is also the thing, it says if multiple targets are hit with a single musket attack, the next shot within 3 seconds applies bleed to all targets. So you can get a little bit of extra AoE damage here if you're shooting into a clump of enemies. The bullets do pass through them. I also think Shooter Stance becomes a bit more viable. Again, in a group sort of scenario, it's assuming that you would have a tank, so you can kind of stand still. But yeah, you're really going to be needing to go for headshots to make this work. And even then, I still think that there are many other weapons that would be better. But if you really want to play Musket in a group PvE scenario, this would probably be the best build to go for, in my opinion. So that's the weapon mastery skill tree for it there. However, PvP is where the musket really shines, and this sort of setup here is what I would go for. So we're going to be using powder burn. There's a perk you can get on your musket, or you can put it on your armor. It's called crippling powder burn. It applies a really nasty slow. It's almost like a 50% slow. It's super disgusting. If you land a headshot, the damage over time effect lasts for approximately 6 months. It's very, very strong. And then you've got power shot and stopping power, which you can load up again. Stopping power also applies another slow. It reduces their stamina, and you want to be going for the max damage you can with the lethal combo. It increases base damage by 17% against targets affected by musket debuff. So you hit them with the crippling powder burn, you put the 7-year slow on them, and then everything else after that just does more damage. So this is the setup that I would recommend with PvP. Typically, this build is also played with the artifact Void Gauntlet. Again, this is much more of a late game thing. But yeah, I think this is the optimal way. This is what I see musket players typically leaning towards. Shooter stance is a bit tricky to pull off. You can go for a trap build, but yeah, just for doing that big, consistent damage, like large chunks of damage, ideally with headshots as well, this is what you would want to play with musket in PvP. The final ranged weapon in this video is the Blunderbuss, and like with the 2 other ranged weapons, I do think it caters itself more towards PvP. It just turns out that in PvE, the novelty of being able to attack enemies from a distance doesn't matter that much, but in PvP, it's a lot more important. So there's some kind of sacrifices there. Just by the nature of the weapon, ranged attacks are more important in PvP because, again, that enemy sort of gap closing thing, you typically have a tank, so you can kind of always be at ranged anyway. It's not as a novel concept. But nonetheless, if you wanted to play Blunderbuss in solo, I think starting things off again with 3 abilities, the first one being Shrapnel Blast, followed by Claw Shot, followed by Splitting Grenade. Net Shot is it's for slowing, which doesn't really matter in PvE. Mortar Charge is just a bit of a meme, and Blast Shot is it's like way too far down on the right hand side skill tree to get early on. And then from here, fully upgrade the Azoth Shrapnel Blast. It's just a pretty solid ability, does a good amount of damage. I also think fully upgrading the Claw Shot. You can use this to pull yourself into an enemy, and then you do a light attack, and then you do Shrapnel Blast, and then another attack. So Blunderbuss sort of works where you weave an attack in between abilities. So Claw Shot, followed by light attack, followed by Shrapnel Blast, followed by attack, followed by Splitting Grenade, followed by light attack. You guys get the idea. It's this sort of rapid going off. And then we do want to go for this left side ultimate. It says the next shot fired within 6 seconds after triggering an ability will have 8 pellets instead of 6. And again, this just kind of works because it's the next shot fired after using an ability. So we ability and then trigger this, and then ability and then trigger this, and then ability and then trigger this. So that's kind of the Blunderbuss playstyle there, and this is what I would use if I was leveling up solo. In group PvE, it's kind of a similar concept where we've still got the 3 same abilities here, and we're still trying to execute the same thing we do in solo. So we're using an ability and then into a attack, and then we use an ability into an attack, and ability into an attack. We've just picked up a few more passives that are going to increase our damage a little bit, and also things that are going to help us stay alive longer, like Last Chance and also On a Roll. And for the PvP build with the net shot, this is where it's really going to shine because we can take advantage of that net shot. Being able to get a 50% slow on the enemy is kind of crazy. We've also got this ultimate over here now that we're leaning towards. Once every 30 seconds, your next ability used will have its cooldown reduced by 50%. The Blunderbuss is a weapon where it is very ability-centric, especially with a perk. Again, we've got another perk recommendation here. It's called Plagued Splitting Grenades, and that is going to enable you to apply disease to the enemy. So basically, whatever ability you use first in the combo is going to come off of cooldown 50% faster. So if you start things off with Plagued Splitting Grenade, and then you do a light attack, and then a net shot, and then a light attack, your Splitting Grenade is going to be off cooldown again, so you can kind of just cycle between them. So still the same concept as what you would do in solo or group PvE, where it's ability, attack, but instead we're leaning more towards the slows, and ideally we want to pick the disease up on the Splitting Grenade with the perk so we can reduce the healing of the enemies. Out of all of the magical weapons, I do believe Fire Staff has the most potential solo. The other weapons like Life Staff, Ice Gauntlet, and Void Gauntlet are more based on survivability, keeping your teammate alive, applying debuffs, but the Fire Staff kind of all just about damage. And to kick things off with the solo build, I think Fireball, Flamethrower, and then an upgrade into Fireball so we can go down to Pillar of Fire. These are just some nice all-round good abilities. You know, you might be some situations where you want to use Meteor Shower or Incinerate and Burnout, very good in PvP, but I think this is going to kick off your leveling and make it quite smooth. So you'd be looking to hit them with Fireball and Pillar of Fire, do a few light attacks until they get close, and then Flamethrower them down. So we take the fully upgraded Flamethrower. You might struggle to, have mana issues with this, so you might want to pop mana potions. Also, if we take spell focus, every time we land a heavy attack, we can get some mana back. And then we can put our few other starting points into fully upgrading Pillar of Fire for the mana, or we can just take some more damage increases like with Spell Slinger, giving us extra crit chance. This is what I think would be a pretty good starting build for solo Fire Staff. And if you wanted to keep putting points in, I think working towards the Runes of Helios ultimate would be better as opposed to Backdraft. For group PvE with the Fire Staff, we're going to be switching out that Flamethrower for Meteor Shower. Now, this is a bit of a wild card. Meteor Shower has seen some changes with the New World Aeternum update, and I think it's going to be pretty good to use at this point, especially on big clumps of enemies. But it is worth mentioning that I think it is a DPS loss if you're playing single target. So if you're just fighting against a boss, you might be better off just using Flamethrower or even, honestly, just spamming light and heavy attacks. But these are the changes that we're going to make over here. Again, we're going for passives that allow us to do more damage over time, give us extra critical damage. All of the passives that effectively allow you to do more damage are what you want to go for. And we still want to be occasionally using heavy attacks and Pillar of Fire to get some mana back as well, because I do think that Fire Staff is quite mana hungry. But ultimately, this is what I would be looking at for a group PvE build with the Fire Staff. In PvP, we're going to be switching out Meteor Shower or Flamethrower for Burnout instead. I just think Burnout, very nice as a movement ability, allows you to create some good distance. You can either get in and explode next to the enemy, or you can get out with Burnout. So just having that movement always feels like it's a good option in PvP. And then we got Fireball and Pillar of Fire, just because they're very consistent for doing damage to single target or even clumps of enemies. But if you wanted to sit more on the back lines, you could play the build somewhat similar to what we had in PvE, where you drop Meteor Shower. You'd very much want to fully upgrade it though, so you can get the Disease. That's going to be very handy on the point to reduce healing from Sacred Ground and Beacon, Orb of Protection, etc. But I think this is a pretty solid standard build for doing range damage with the Fire Staff in Outpost Rush, 3v3 Arena, etc. At time of recording, Life Staff is New World Aeternum's only dedicated healing weapon. Void Gauntlet and Flail can put out some healing, but nowhere near as much as the Life Staff. That being said, it is still a weapon you can use solo. The way that you would typically play Life Staff solo is to place down some heals that you can stand in, and then switch over to your secondary weapon and start attacking the enemies while you're standing inside your healing. To enable that, you want to pick up your sort of ground-based AoE heals, and that is Sacred Ground, Orb of Protection, and Beacon. However, Orb of Protection will only heal yourself if you fully upgrade it. So you need to go all the way down to the Aegis upgrade in order to actually be an AoE heal. But you can use it as a damaging ability as well. So if you do like a heavy attack straight into an Orb of Protection, followed by another heavy attack straight into Beacon, you can kind of do this sort of animation cancel, get a little bit of damage burst there. Also, Sacred Ground is another ability that you really want to be fully upgrading, so putting 1 point into Sacred and then choosing either Desperate Speed or Revitalize. Desperate Speed gives you cooldown reduction when you're healing, whereas this one requires you to be attacking with the Life Staff, which again, as we covered, you don't really want to be doing, so I guess it would go over here. And then there's another couple passives that you can pick up fairly early on. Bend Light says after you dodge, your healing's more effective, so dodge before you put down your heals. And then if you have a buff, which is fairly easy to achieve, there's a lot of things in the game that give you a buff, especially in the Life Staff skill tree, like Orb of Protection, then your following heals are 20% stronger. And this is what I think makes a fairly good baseline build for the Life Staff. So you put down you dodge, then you put down your Sacred Ground, your Orb of Protection, splash it on the ground, and Beacon, and then you just switch to your other weapon and start swinging. In group PvE like Expeditions, there are a bunch of different ways you can play the Life Staff. This is probably one of the most common that I would see, and this is when you pair it with a Void Gauntlet. So it's a similar concept to what you do in solo, where you place down your heals, but this time you put them on your teammates, and then you switch over to the Void Gauntlet, you do the Void Gauntlet stuff, and you start swinging with the Void Blades. So yeah, putting a Sacred Ground on the tank, followed by the Orb, followed by the Beacon, and then switching, getting inside the heals and basically being in there with your melee DPS as well. One thing you may notice is we don't have an ultimate with this build though, and the reason behind that is there's nothing we can really give up on the right side that kind of works. We can get rid of Protector's Touch and put one more point over here, but then we still don't have a point for the ultimate. So you'd have to kind of sacrifice something like this, which makes Beacon last longer to do it, but I don't necessarily think that's worth it, because the 5 extra seconds on Beacon, I believe, is more powerful than the Divine Blessing. And you don't really want to be giving up Protective Strength, because that's 20% healing, that's 20% healing, and it's a bit of an awkward one. But if you really want to make this work, I think instead you could try and go like Splash of Light. Some sort of build like this would work as well, and we'd go for the full upgrade over there. So a couple of different options I'm going to outline for you guys. The classic is to go for the Beacon instead of Splash of Light, but if you want to be less aggressive and more a sort of true dedicated healer, then I guess this would be the build that I would recommend for group PvE. For PvP with the Life Staff, again, there are quite a few different options. Splash of Light with its recent buff is a very strong consideration, but I'm going to be suggesting Sacred Ground, Divine Embrace, and Beacon. Divine Embrace is a very powerful single target heal with another perk you can get called Refreshing Divine Embrace. It just massively lowers the cooldown. When you're healing somebody below 50% rather, you can effectively use it back to back. Beacon, it's got a movement speed increase, and it's also just a nice AoE heal, and Sacred Ground is just crazy good because of Anointed. So yeah, if you wanted to go more AoE orientated, you could switch out Divine Embrace for Splash of Light, but I think this is a pretty solid build for healing. However, if you are playing with controller, I will acknowledge that from my personal experience, using Divine Embrace is it's a bit difficult. Single target heals with controller don't feel that great right now, so if you are playing with a controller, you might want to consider going Splash of Light instead. For like healing settings and stuff like that and healer playstyle, again, I have spent a bit of time, so check out the video that I've got coming up on healing in New World with mouse and keyboard and with controller. If it's out already, there'll be a link up in the top right. If not, subscribe, and just, the video will be coming out at some point in the near future. Ice Gauntlet is a weapon that's typically used as a secondary, and by that I mean you would have your primary weapon that you spend most time attacking with, but you would switch to the Ice Gauntlet to use its abilities and then switch back. However, if you did want to use Ice Gauntlet as a primary weapon while you were leveling up, I think focusing on the Ice Tempest side of the skill tree would be the way to go. So starting off with Ice Storm, then Ice Spike, and then Wind Chill. Ice Spike's a bit of a tricky one to use. It takes a bit of time because you fire it out and then you have to fire again to sort of get the spike to go up in the air, but it can be very rewarding when you land it. I think a fully upgraded Ice Storm is definitely a way to go, and also fully upgrading your Wind Chill for the extra damage it gives, also worthwhile. And then from here, we're just going to put points into a few passives to unlock the Ultimate Chill, which is basically allowing you to do extra damage to targets that are chilled. And you can apply Chill with Ice Storm, you can apply it with Wind Chill, and then you can follow up with Ice Spike, allowing it to do 25% extra damage. So let's grab Critical Frost for the crit chance, and then we'll go for Ultimate Chill. And this would be the startings of a build for solo leveling with the Ice Gauntlet. If you were playing Ice Gauntlet in a group PvE scenario, again, it's very likely that it would be your secondary weapon. So you'd have a primary of like a Rapier or a Fire Staff, and that's what you would be doing most of your damage with. And you would just switch to the Ice Gauntlet to drop some abilities and then switch back. So with that in mind, we've gone for a fully upgraded Ice Storm, so you can plop that on the enemies. Ice Shower, which you can use occasionally to prevent enemies from pushing in on your healer or to wall off a certain section. And then Ice Pylon, it's one of the few abilities, if not the only ability in the game, that's effectively like a summon. So you can summon the Pylon, let it do its thing, and even when you switch back, it maintains its like position in the world and keeps doing damage. So fully leaning into that as opposed to Ultimate Chill, which goes away when you weapon swap, whereas this one is a bit more persistent. So these are the three abilities that I'm recommending, but bear in mind that it is more of a secondary playstyle where you're using the abilities and then switching over to your primary weapon. If you're PvPing with an Ice Gauntlet, there are many different ways to play it. I think every ability has some validity to it, but we're going to go for a very aggressive sort of PvP build here where Ice Gauntlet would be your main weapon, and it's going to work similar to what we outlined with the solo PvE leveling build where you're putting Ice Storm on the enemy, Wind Chill to push them back, applying Chill to them to then make that Ice Spike do a lot of damage. Ultimately, the sort of magic combo would be to go for Ice Storm and then hit a heavy attack on them, which would root them in place, and then hopefully go for the Ice Spike for a huge chunk of burst damage. And if you've got melee players pushing in on you, you can also use Wind Chill. And if you land all of the Wind Chill, like I think it's consecutive stacks of Wind Chill, you can root them in place as well, which also then can set up a Ice Spike. So that's the combo here. We're picking up a few passives on the right side that effectively help us stay alive, like some cooldown reduction, slowing down the enemy. And you can also block. It's a very unusual or unique thing to the Ice Gauntlet where you can use your mana as stamina effectively. That's also kind of cool as well. And then finally, on the list of weapons in New World Aeternum, we have the Void Gauntlet. Again, like with the Ice Gauntlet, this is typically played as more of a secondary weapon, but if you did want to play it solo and leveling up, there is definitely a way to do that, and it would involve picking up Void Blade, Oblivion, and Orb of Decay. So you put your Oblivion down and stand inside of it for the extra damage increase. Then you could pop Orb of Decay just to do a bit of extra damage. It also heals on the way back for yourself. And then you activate Void Blade, and this is the way that you're going to spend most of your time doing damage. So like with the Hatchet, Void Gauntlet's a bit of an unusual one where it's typically a ranged weapon, but you can activate Void Blade to make it do melee damage. And we want to lean into that with the Void Blade by picking up the Fortify, Also, I think grabbing Withering Oblivion, which inflicts weaken on the enemy so they don't do as much damage to you, is kind of nice. We can also get some critical damage on the Void Gauntlet. And then there's a lot of other passives over here which we can pick up, which increase our healing and our crit chance and cooldown reduction. So cooldown reduction, crit chance, cooldown reduction, and then ultimately going towards Void Caller. It says, on a successful ability hit, gain Void Essence. At 6 stacks, you get a little circle around you, which heals you and does damage to the enemies. So it's just going to help, again, with staying alive. So this is our initial setup for a Void Gauntlet if you were playing solo and leveling up with it. I think from here, it would definitely be worth upgrading the Orb of Decay just to get some extra damage. You can see it does bonus damage to AI. Additional 30% base damage to hostile AI targets, kind of like halfway down the description of it there. In group PvE with the Void Gauntlet, there are a bunch of different ways you can play it. You don't have to go for the Void Blade. If you want to be more of a backline, like a healer, you could go for Tether instead of Void Blade, or you could go for Essence Rupture instead of Void Blade. But as a default, this is, again, it's fairly similar to the solo leveling build, honestly. We just got a fully upgraded Orb of Decay now, and we've picked up a few more passives, which are going to help us with mana and also dealing more damage. But yeah, baseline option here. We could also switch out the Void Blade, pick up Rupture, or even pick up Tether, something like that as well. This would be entirely viable if you wanted to switch that and be more of a sort of backline support instead of an aggressor with the Void Blade in group PvE. And then finally, for the Void Gauntlet in PvP, I like to do things a bit different here. So we have Scream, Tether, and Orb of Decay. Now, in order to really make this build work, you're going to be using Void Gauntlet as a secondary. So it's not going to be a primary weapon. You're not going to be using it to do damage that much. Instead, you'll be using something like the Ice Gauntlet, the Bow, or the Musket, and you'll switch over to the Void Gauntlet to effectively cast the abilities and then switch back. There is a perk you can get with Baleful Tether. It's called Slowing Tether, if I'm not mistaken. It applies a slow to the enemy, which is pretty nasty. And then there's also another very powerful perk you can get called Putrefying Scream. You can put that on the Void Gauntlet or on your armor, and it says when the Scream hits the enemy, it reduces their incoming healing by applying a very potent disease. So yeah, it's effectively just a secondary back bar kind of weapon where you use the abilities to supplement or add extra debuffs to the enemy before switching back to your primary weapon to get the kill. That's kind of like the playstyle of the Void Gauntlet in PvP, in my opinion. It's also worth mentioning you can make a switch for Orb of Decay if you want to be even more support or debuff orientated. There's a perk you can get on Oblivion called Nullifying Oblivion, and it strips away buffs from the enemies. That's very, very powerful in PvP as well. So you might want to consider switching Orb of Decay or Baleful Tether for Oblivion so you can get that Nullifying Oblivion perk. Again, very potent in sort of coordinated large-scale PvP. All right, friends, and that is going to do it for this look at weapon mastery for weapons in New World Aeternum. Again, I know we didn't cover attributes and equip load and gear and all of that stuff, but as you can appreciate, looking at the length of this video, it's already gotten pretty long right now, but as I mentioned earlier, if you do want to deep dive on particular weapons, if you want to know what weapons synergize with bow and where you should put your attributes and equip loads, we'll be doing more focus builds on different variants. So, you know, we'll be looking specifically at the Void Gauntlet and what pairs with it. We'll be looking specifically at the Great Axe and what pairs with that and attributes and stuff. So if you're interested for those videos, there is a particular weapon you'd really like to know about, let me know in the comments down below. You can also hop into the stream as well. I'm going to be streaming New World Aeternum almost every day from the 15th of October onwards, and I'm very happy to answer questions and do some sort of build deep dives over there. So links to the stream in the description down below, twitch.tv/BagginsTV. But yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, leave a like, a comment, subscribe for more New World Aeternum content, and I'll catch you guys all in the next video.